A young black man stands in court for the first time in his life. No weapons, no violence, no criminal past. Just one mistake. But the judge doesn't care. He leans forward and gives him 22 years. What no one in that courtroom knows is that the man they just buried in prison has a brother. Not just any brother, the governor of the state. And now everything is about to change. Before we start the story, comment below where in the world you're watching from today. And if you like stories like this, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The courtroom was packed. People shifted in their seats, whispering under their breath, eyes locked on the young black man standing near the defense table. His name was Kareem Ward. He wore a plain blue shirt and handcuffs that looked too tight on his wrists. His eyes stayed focused, steady, like a man who had already accepted whatever was coming. The judge leaned forward, his mouth pulled into a hard line as he read from a paper in front of him. 22 years in state prison, he said without emotion. A few gasps echoed from the back row. One woman put her hand over her mouth. Kareem didn't blink. He didn't flinch. He just lowered his head slightly as if the weight of the years had already settled on his shoulders. Judge Clarence O'Connor, known for his cold stare and heavy sentences, looked pleased with himself. He glanced at Kareem like he was just another case number, nothing more. Maybe now, he said, voice sharp and dry, you'll learn to respect the law. The courtroom fell silent again. Even the bailiff hesitated before stepping forward. Kareem was taken by the arm and led away, still silent, still calm, like someone who had lost something far before the sentence had even been read. In the very last row of the courtroom, a man in a dark suit watched everything without a word. No one noticed him. His hands stayed folded, his face unreadable, but his eyes followed every movement. He didn't react when the sentence was given. He didn't speak when the judge made his final remarks. But something behind his eyes changed when he saw the cuffs tighten around Kareem's wrists. That man's name was Elijah Ward, Governor Elijah Ward. He had come quietly, sitting alone, keeping his presence low. For years, he had stayed away from the spotlight unless it was for speeches, negotiations, or the business of running the state. He had built a name that carried power, respect, and fear. People shook his hand, smiled at him on the streets, and spoke his name with pride. But right now, sitting in the back of that courtroom, he wasn't a politician. He wasn't the governor. He was just a brother, watching his own blood be dragged away in chains. And Judge Clarence O'Connor, who had just thrown away Kareem's future like it meant nothing, he had no idea who was sitting in that courtroom, and even less idea what was coming. Kareem sat in the back of the prison transport van, hands cuffed in front of him, ankles chained to the floor. The ride was long, quiet, and cold. He didn't look out the window. He already knew what was out there, freedom slipping farther and farther away. He kept his eyes down, jaw tight, breathing slow. In his mind, he replayed the judge's words over and over like a bad song that wouldn't stop. 22 years for something he didn't even do. One mistake, one wrong car, one system that never gave him a chance. He had borrowed his friend Darnell's car to run a quick errand. He didn't know anything about what was in the glove box. The phone found there wasn't his. The police didn't care. No fingerprints, no proof he used it. Didn't matter. What mattered was that Kareem had dark skin and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. The public defender they gave him barely said 10 words in court. Didn't ask questions. Didn't fight. Kareem stood there alone, trying to explain himself to people who didn't care about the truth. He had refused to call his brother. He didn't want that kind of help. Elijah had worked his way up to the top, the first black governor of the state, and Kareem didn't want to be the one who dragged his name into a scandal. So he faced the court with his chin up, thinking maybe, just maybe, if he showed he wasn't afraid, they would show mercy. He was wrong. Back in the courtroom, Elijah stayed seated after everyone had left. His eyes were still locked on the judge's bench. His thoughts were louder than the silence around him. Kareem hadn't told him anything about the case until it was too late. He had watched the trial from the back, not as a politician, not as a leader, but as a man who had once promised to protect his younger brother and failed. Their history was not simple. After their parents died, Elijah had raised Kareem for a few years before going off to college. He tried to stay involved, tried to send money, check in when he could, but politics pulled him in deeper every year. The distance grew. Kareem had grown up without a safety net, figuring things out on his own. And now here he was, locked in chains because Elijah hadn't been there. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed. Reporters stood in small clusters, talking about a different case, a different headline. No one mentioned Kareem. No one noticed Elijah leaving through the side entrance, his face tight with something between guilt and fury. Inside the car, Elijah sat in silence. His driver glanced at him through the mirror but didn't say a word. Elijah's phone buzzed with messages, meetings, schedules, but he ignored them all. His mind was stuck in that courtroom. The judge's voice, the sentence, Kareem's face. He had stayed quiet for too long. Now, he wasn't sure silence was an option anymore. Elijah didn't sleep that night. He sat at the edge of his bed, still wearing the same suit from court, tie loosened, jacket on the floor. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that pressed into his chest. His phone buzzed a few times, but he didn't check it. His thoughts were locked on Kareem, on the handcuffs, on the judge's voice, cold and steady, like he was reading off a grocery list instead of destroying someone's life. He opened his laptop and began pulling up files, case records, court transcripts, Judge Clarence O'Connor's history. A pattern began to show itself. Dozens of cases over the last 10 years. Harsh sentences, young black men, nonviolent charges, suspicious plea deals, lawyers who barely fought. Elijah clicked through pages of data, each one adding to the tight knot growing in his chest. It wasn't just about Kareem. This judge had done it again and again, and no one had stopped him. He picked up his phone and called someone he hadn't spoken to in months. Layla James, a civil rights attorney who used to work with him during his early days in politics. She answered on the second ring. Elijah? Her voice was cautious. I need a favor, he said, voice flat. She didn't ask why. Tell me where to start. I need everything you can find on Clarence O'Connor. Sentencing history, complaints, off-the-record stuff, everything. There was a pause. Is this about your brother? Yes. I heard about the case, she said quietly. It's bad. It's worse than bad, and I think it's only the surface. She sighed. All right, give me 24 hours. He ended the call without another word and leaned back, staring at the ceiling. His heart was pounding, but his mind was clear. He had been careful for years, staying out of family matters when they could harm his position. But that line was gone now. This wasn't about optics anymore. This was about blood. Meanwhile, Kareem sat in his cell. His face was still swollen from the intake process, pushed, searched, shoved into a space that smelled like sweat and cold metal. He didn't say much, just lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling, trying to slow his breathing. The other inmates ignored him at first, then watched him closely. New faces always brought tension. Kareem kept to himself, but even that didn't help much. On his second night, someone tried to test him. Words turned into threats. Threats turned into a cheap punch while his back was turned. He didn't fight back. He just stood still and took it. Let them get it out of their system. It was better that way, safer. But later, when the lights went out and everything went quiet, Kareem sat up. His lip was bleeding. His fists were tight. And for the first time, he let himself think about Elijah. Not with anger, with disappointment. His big brother, the one who always said he'd protect him, was nowhere to be found when it mattered. At least, that's what he thought. He didn't know that, right at that moment, Elijah was staring at Judge O'Connor's face on his screen, reading a report about a past case where the defendant had died in custody. No investigation, no suspension, just silence. The judge had moved on like nothing happened. Elijah's jaw clenched. Not this time, he muttered under his breath. The next morning, Elijah walked into the governor's office earlier than usual. His staff greeted him with the usual quick updates, press schedules, meetings with donors, education reforms, but he waved it all off. Clear my morning, he said, voice sharp. No interruptions. His assistant Liana blinked, surprised by the tone, but nodded without asking questions. He shut the door behind him and went straight to the locked drawer in his desk. Inside was a small folder labeled Internal Oversight: Judicial. It wasn't public. It wasn't even official. It was a quiet collection of complaints and red flags that had landed on his desk over the last 3 years. Stuff other politicians ignored. Anonymous letters, tip-offs from retired judges, half-truths, whispers, and one name showed up more than once: Judge Clarence O'Connor. Elijah laid the papers out in front of him. One caught his attention: a complaint from a court clerk 2 years ago. It described the judge making comments behind closed doors: racist, bitter, cruel. The complaint was dropped before it went anywhere. Another file: an appeal that never reached the higher courts. Defendant died in custody before it was heard. Another coincidence. Another silence. His phone lit up. Layla had sent a file. He opened it and started scrolling. The report was thicker than he expected. She hadn't wasted time. Charts showing sentencing patterns: black defendants receiving sentences nearly twice as long as white defendants for the same charges. Private meetings with prosecutors. Cases without jury trials. Too many things that didn't look right. And there was one more file, something personal, a sealed disciplinary report from 20 years ago, hidden behind a judge's board review. Back when O'Connor was a young prosecutor, before he wore a robe. A misconduct claim. Fabricated evidence. The report was closed quietly, but the stain remained if you knew where to look. Elijah leaned back, his fingers steepled in front of his mouth. He had enough to start something. Not enough to bring O'Connor down yet, but it was a crack. That same afternoon, O'Connor was in his office at the courthouse, feet on his desk, sipping coffee like he hadn't just buried a man's life the day before. A young clerk came in with a file. "You have a memo from the governor's office," she said, dropping it on the desk. He raised an eyebrow and opened it. His eyes scanned the first page. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't formal. It was just a short note printed in clean, bold letters. Docket number 6271. Sentencing review requested. Personal interest noted. Office of the Governor. He frowned. That docket number was Kareem Ward's case. He flipped the memo over, and there it was. A photo. 2 boys, maybe 15 and 10 years old, sitting on a porch. One had a book in his hand, the other a scraped knee in a toy car. Both smiling. At the bottom of the photo was a handwritten note. "Some names carry more weight than you think." O'Connor stared at it for a long time, fingers frozen. Back in the prison, Kareem sat at the edge of his bunk. Another guard had looked at him funny that morning, a longer stare, like he knew something Kareem didn't. The food tray was late. His phone call was denied. Something was changing, but no one had told him what. He didn't ask questions. He just sat there, back straight, breathing slow, as if his body already knew the storm that was starting to build outside. That evening, Elijah found himself staring out the tall windows of the governor's mansion, arms crossed, untouched coffee cooling on the table beside him. Rain tapped against the glass in steady rhythm, but his thoughts were louder. His eyes were fixed on nothing, yet his mind was working nonstop. Every hour since the sentencing had felt like a test of who he was, not as a politician, but as a brother. He had spent years building an image of control, of strength, of balance, but none of it mattered now. None of the speeches or the handshakes or the polite smiles could erase the look on Kareem's face when they led him out of that courtroom. He turned back to the table and sat down in front of his laptop. A new message waited from Layla. The subject line read, "You were right." He clicked it open. Attached were court surveillance images from a case 6 months earlier. Same judge, same courtroom, same pattern. A young man, first offense, no violence, sentenced to 18 years. The reason? The judge said he didn't seem remorseful enough. The defendant had cried the whole time. Elijah scrolled through the rest. A woman had come forward, a former court reporter who had worked under O'Connor years ago. She claimed the judge once bragged at a private dinner that his courtroom ran better when people knew who was in charge. According to her, he liked to make examples of people who looked like they needed humbling. She never filed a complaint, said it wouldn't go anywhere, said she wanted to keep her job. Elijah closed the email and leaned back in his chair. His hands came together, fingers locking. He had the pieces. Not all of them, but enough to make the next move. He pulled out his phone and called Jacob Brandt, the state's inspector general. A man with few words and even fewer friends, but loyal to the law. Jacob answered on the first ring. "Governor, I need an informal inquiry started. Quiet. Target is Judge Clarence O'Connor." There was a long silence on the other end. Then, "Understood." "No leaks, Jacob." "There won't be." Elijah hung up. His next call was to the communications director. "I want to meet with the heads of the Judicial Review Board next week. Make it happen." Meanwhile, Kareem's days inside the prison moved slow, but the tension had started to rise. Word had gotten around that he wasn't just any inmate. A few officers had started treating him differently. Less rough, more careful. One had even slipped him an extra carton of milk at breakfast and kept walking like nothing happened. That night, he was called out of his cell for what they called a random check. He knew it wasn't random. Two guards led him into a private room. It was cold, fluorescent lights buzzing above. They sat him down, closed the door, and stood on either side without speaking. One of them finally broke the silence. "You've got some eyes on you," the guard said, arms folded. Kareem didn't answer. The second guard nodded. "Something's shifting. Nobody told us anything, but we're not stupid." Kareem kept his tone steady. "You planning to do something about it?" They didn't answer right away, just exchanged a glance. Then the first guard stepped forward and unlocked his cuffs. "Watch your back," he said, then turned and opened the door. "We don't know what's coming, but we know who's watching." Kareem walked out, confused but calm. He didn't know what Elijah was doing. He didn't even know if Elijah was doing anything. But something had changed. He could feel it in the way people looked at him now. Not with the same disgust, not with the same casual disrespect. There was hesitation in their eyes, and sometimes fear. Across the city, Judge O'Connor sat at his dining table with a glass of bourbon in his hand. The photo from the memo still rested on the corner of his desk. He'd looked at it more than once. He remembered the name now, Elijah Ward. Governor. Powerful. Calculated. Dangerous. He thought about the memo, the tone, the message. The governor hadn't accused him of anything. He hadn't even threatened him, but the silence spoke louder than any words could. O'Connor stood and walked to the window, staring out into the night. His fingers tapped against the glass. His world had been stable for a long time. He had made his own rules in the courtroom and never once paid a price. But something about that photo, the brother in chains, the brother in power, it gnawed at him. Not because he cared, but because it meant he might not be untouchable anymore. And that scared him, even if he didn't show it. 2 days later, Elijah arrived at the State Judicial Review Office for a closed-door meeting. No press, no cameras, just 4 men in suits, all older, all careful with their words. These were the people who decided whether judges stayed or fell. Most of the time, they did nothing. Their hands were tied with politics, connections, and fear of shaking the wrong tree. Elijah knew that. He also knew he didn't come here to ask nicely. He took his seat at the end of the long oak table, dropping a thick manila folder in front of him. He didn't open it yet, just looked at each of the men one by one. "I'm here off the record," he said calmly, "but that won't last long." Judge William Hawthorne, the most senior on the board, shifted in his seat. "Governor, you're not in the habit of holding your own accountable," Elijah cut in, voice still level. "But you're going to change that, starting today." The room tensed. No one spoke for a few seconds. Elijah opened the folder and slid out printed documents, sentencing charts, witness statements, unheard complaints. "I'm handing you a pattern. Not one mistake, not two. A pattern that spans years, and that includes more than just bias. It includes misconduct, negligence, and possible abuse of judicial power." "Are you accusing a sitting judge of criminal behavior?" asked Martin Kessler, another board member, tone cautious. "I'm not accusing him," Elijah replied. "I'm giving you proof. Whether you call it criminal is up to you. But if you sit on this, I'll go public. And when I do, your names will be the next ones people ask about." He pushed the last photo across the table, the one with him and Kareem, the one O'Connor had received in the memo. "That's my brother. He's sitting in prison because your system protects people like Clarence O'Connor. 22 years. First offense, nonviolent. The sentence was personal. He never stood a chance." The room fell silent again. Hawthorne exhaled slowly. This is bigger than just us, Governor. We'd need federal approval too. You'll have it, Elijah said before he could finish. I've already made the calls. All I need from you is movement. I don't care how slow it starts. But it starts today. There was no vote, no agreement made out loud, but the papers stayed on the table as Elijah stood and left the room. That was enough for now. He wasn't finished. Not even close. Back in prison, Kareem stood in line during chow time, tray in hand. It was loud, metal clanking, voices rising all around him. He usually kept to himself, ate fast, left faster. But today was different. A man he didn't know, a tall guy named Wesley who ran the kitchen, stepped beside him and nodded. "You got people," Wesley said under his breath. Kareem looked at him, confused. "People watching," Wesley added. "People making noise." Kareem kept his voice low. "What kind of noise?" "The kind that makes guards nervous. Word is, your file's getting reviewed. Some of them think you're about to be moved. Others think you're about to walk." Kareem didn't react. He just grabbed his tray and kept moving. But that night, when the lights went out, he didn't lie down right away. He sat on his bunk staring at the wall. His thoughts were sharp, tangled. Was Elijah behind this? Was it real? Or just more prison talk? He didn't want hope. Hope had cost him too much already. Back at the courthouse, O'Connor was having his own kind of evening. The judicial board had requested a meeting. He didn't like that. He hadn't been called in for anything serious in years. Still, he played it cool, walked in with his usual confidence, but the tone in the room was different this time. They asked questions, detailed ones, about specific cases, dates, remarks he'd made in court. Some of the complaints were ones he thought were buried years ago. Others were brand new. Someone was digging. Someone had found more than he expected. And then they asked about Kareem Ward. O'Connor's jaw tightened slightly. "I ruled based on the facts presented. His lawyer barely had a defense. The man had stolen property in a car. That's a felony. But the sentence," one of the board members said carefully, "was extreme." "The law gives me that discretion," O'Connor replied. "I used it." "Perhaps too comfortably," came the reply. O'Connor sat back in his chair, eyes narrowing. He knew what this was now. A warning. A quiet one, wrapped in polite questions. But it was still a warning, and that made one thing clear. He wasn't as protected as he used to be. That night, as he left the courthouse and walked to his car, he noticed something strange. A man across the street, leaning on a lamppost, not moving, just watching. O'Connor stared at him for a few seconds before getting into his car. He drove off slowly, eyes flicking to the mirror. The man didn't follow, but he also didn't look away, and Judge Clarence O'Connor had never felt that kind of silence before. Elijah sat in the back of a black SUV, arms crossed, fingers drumming against his sleeve, watching the streets roll by through the tinted window. His driver didn't speak. No one in the vehicle did. They were heading to a quiet meeting spot in the industrial district, the kind of place no one noticed. No press, no cameras, no curious eyes. Just silence, concrete and truth. Inside a low-rise brick building, Layla was waiting. She had brought someone with her, Malcolm Reyes, a retired state prosecutor who had once been forced out for questioning a senior judge's ethics. That judge had been O'Connor. Elijah walked in, nodded once, and went straight to the point. "I need to know if we can bring formal charges against him." Malcolm raised his brow. "You don't want to just ruin his career?" "I want him off the bench and under a spotlight," Elijah said. "A real one, not just whispers in closed rooms." Malcolm opened a folder filled with yellow documents, court notes, red-stamped files. "Then you'll need more than bias. You'll need to show intent, abuse of authority, maybe even case tampering. If you want to take down a judge, you can't just prove he was wrong. You have to prove he was never fair to begin with." Layla added, "The prison pipeline he's helped build? It's massive. Private contracts, kickbacks to legal firms. We're pulling bank records now." Elijah nodded slowly. "Good. Keep digging." Malcolm leaned forward. "But I've got to ask, why now? You've known what kind of man he is. You've seen his name come up before?" Elijah's eyes didn't waver. "Because now it's not just the system he's hurting. Now it's my brother." Malcolm didn't speak after that. He just nodded, like a man who understood that personal pain always made the sharpest blade. While Elijah was moving quietly through political channels, Kareem was sitting in a room that looked nothing like the ones he'd gotten used to. No bars, no chains, just a steel chair, a metal table, and two officers in plain clothes standing across from him. They hadn't told him why they brought him there, just walked him out of his cell in the middle of the afternoon without a word. One of the officers, a short man with thinning hair, finally spoke. "We're reviewing your sentence." Kareem didn't respond. He had learned not to get pulled into conversations that sounded like promises. The man continued, "Your case caught attention. Some people are saying your sentence wasn't justified, that maybe the judge had something personal against you." Still nothing from Kareem. He just stared, steady, unreadable. The second officer tried a different approach. "Your brother's been asking questions. High places, real pressure." Kareem's jaw moved just slightly, a small shift, barely a reaction. But inside, his stomach twisted. The first officer sat down across from him. "You didn't use your brother's name once during trial. That says a lot." Kareem finally spoke, voice quiet. "Didn't think I needed to." The man leaned back, looking at him. "Well, you do now, because things are changing, whether you like it or not." Back at the mansion, Elijah stood in front of his fireplace, a single piece of paper in his hand. It was a summary memo from the state auditor's office, a copy of a financial trail linking Judge O'Connor to a group of private detention contractors. It wasn't illegal, but it was suspicious. The judge had bought shares in a company that profited off long-term sentences, and he bought those shares just weeks before handing out 3 unusually long ones, including Kareem's. Elijah folded the paper and placed it in his pocket. Then his phone rang. It was Liana, his assistant. "Sir," she said, "there's a situation." "What kind of situation?" "O'Connor just filed a complaint." Elijah paused. "Against who?" "You. He's accusing you of interfering with the judiciary, overstepping your office." Elijah laughed once under his breath. "He's scared." "There's more. He's going on television tonight." Elijah's eyes narrowed. "Good. Let him talk." That night, the city watched as Judge Clarence O'Connor sat across from a local anchor on a live news broadcast, wearing a gray suit and his trademark smirk. He spoke about law, about order, about politicians trying to inject family matters into justice. He never said Kareem's name, never said Elijah's. But everyone watching understood who he meant. "I stand by my sentence," O'Connor said confidently. "I will not be bullied by anyone, regardless of their title." Elijah sat in his living room, watching the broadcast. He didn't flinch, didn't change his expression. He simply reached for the remote, paused the screen on O'Connor's face, and stared. The same smirk, the same look he gave in the courtroom. That night, Elijah made one more call. Not to a politician, not to a lawyer. He called a reporter, one with no ties to the governor's office, one who had once written a story about a dead prisoner with bruises and a silenced complaint. He said 3 words. "I'm ready now." Morning came heavy. The city buzzed, headlines screamed, and across the state, people were waking up to a name they hadn't heard before. Kareem Ward. Front pages ran a still image of him in court, eyes locked on the judge, posture calm, the headline in bold, 22 years for a first offense. Who is this man? Underneath that, another line. Governor's brother or victim of a broken system? The news didn't say much. Not yet, but it said enough. Just enough to stir curiosity. Just enough to shake the image O'Connor had tried to build on live TV the night before. By noon, Elijah's phone hadn't stopped ringing. Advisors, lawyers, party leaders. A few wanted him to back down. Others begged him to keep going. His press secretary asked if he wanted to make a statement. He told her no. He had already made his move. The reporter he called the night before, Talia Brooks, known for digging where others wouldn't, had been handed everything. Court records, sealed complaints, financial papers, witness names, the photo. She worked fast. She always did. Her article was fire on dry grass. It broke at 8 a.m. sharp. Behind the bench, the quiet power of Judge Clarence O'Connor. In it, she laid out the connections. O'Connor's ties to private detention contractors, The sealed misconduct report from his time as a prosecutor. The statistics showing his disproportionate sentencing patterns. The silence from the courts. And yes, she named Kareem. She mentioned the relation, but she didn't frame it as politics. She framed it as a question of justice. By the time Elijah arrived at the Capitol for his afternoon briefing, the halls were buzzing. Staffers stared as he passed. Some nodded. Others looked worried, but no one said a word to his face. Inside the office, Liana waited with a tight look on her face. "They're rattled," she said simply. "Elaborate. The Judiciary Board is meeting behind closed doors. Again. Word is they're deciding whether to recommend O'Connor for emergency suspension, and the Chief Justice just issued a public statement." "What kind of statement?" She passed him her phone. Elijah read the words carefully. "We are aware of the recent allegations involving Judge O'Connor. The integrity of our courts must remain unquestioned. We have launched an internal inquiry." He handed the phone back. "It's a shield, but it'll do." Meanwhile, O'Connor was in his chambers, fuming. The article had hit him like a slap. He paced the room, flipping through the pages, his lips pressed thin, his hand trembling just slightly as he read his own words quoted back at him. Things he thought had been forgotten, buried. Things he thought had been sealed forever. His assistant knocked on the door. "Sir, your 3 p.m. hearing—" "Reschedule it," he barked. "Sir, it's a sentencing—" "I said reschedule." He sat down heavily behind his desk, shoulders tense, eyes still locked on the article. He had underestimated Elijah. That had been his mistake. He had thought the governor would keep quiet, that he wouldn't risk his position, that he'd let his brother fade behind bars like so many others. But now the whole state was watching. Back in the prison, Kareem was pulled from his cell again. This time, no guards said a word. They walked him down the hallway, past curious stairs, into a private room with a video monitor on the wall. A man in a gray suit appeared on the screen, a legal advisor from the state. "You're not under questioning," the man said, calm and professional. "We're informing you of a sentence review. Your case is being re-examined." Kareem didn't speak. The advisor continued. "Your legal representation is being replaced. You'll be assigned a new lawyer, one who answers to the governor's office directly." Kareem's eyes narrowed. "Why now?" The man paused. "Because someone finally decided not to stay quiet." Later that night, as he lay on his bunk, Kareem stared at the ceiling, hands folded across his chest. He still didn't know what was coming. He didn't know how far Elijah would go. But for the first time since the day he was arrested, the silence didn't feel like the end. It felt like something else, like the start of a storm. Across the city, Elijah stood on a balcony, phone in his hand, wind brushing against his sleeves. He had received a single text from Talia Brooks. "They're coming undone. All of them." He looked out over the skyline. "They should be," he whispered to himself. Then he walked back inside. He still had work to do. The next morning began with chaos. News vans lined the steps of the state courthouse. Reporters gathered in small circles, checking their notes, adjusting their microphones, waiting for the moment to start speaking live. Photographers jockeyed for angles. Inside, the air buzzed with nervous energy. The Judicial Conduct Board had called an emergency meeting. It wasn't public, but everyone knew what it was about. The media had the scent. The story had gone national overnight. Judge Clarence O'Connor arrived through the side entrance, shielded by 2 security officers. His face was pale, jaw tight, and his usual smugness gone. The hallway was lined with stares, some from court clerks, others from lawyers who had once feared him. No one said a word, but their silence spoke louder than any headline. In the meeting room, he sat across from 6 board members. This time, there was no laughter, no handshakes, no quiet jokes about making an example of anyone. Just papers, thick files, stacks of them, all printed from the evidence Elijah had carefully delivered. One of the board members, a man named Collins, adjusted his glasses and looked directly at O'Connor. "We've received verified reports of judicial misconduct, possible financial conflicts of interest, and evidence suggesting racial bias in your courtroom. We are moving forward with suspension proceedings pending further investigation." O'Connor clenched his jaw. "This is political," he snapped. "You're letting one man's grudge control the room." "No," Collins replied firmly. We're letting your record control the room." That same hour, Elijah stood in a press briefing room, suit crisp, voice measured. Dozens of reporters pointed cameras and held recorders toward him. He spoke calmly, clearly, not as a brother, but as a governor. "Our courts must be places of fairness, not fear. Our judges must be held to the highest standards. No one is above review. No title, no position, and no bench protects someone from accountability." He didn't name Clarence O'Connor. He didn't have to. After the speech, he walked off stage without taking questions. His team surrounded him quickly, but Elijah raised a hand, signaling he wanted space. He headed into his office, shut the door, and took a deep breath. His heart was pounding. Not from nerves, from focus, from fire. He hadn't felt this alive in years. The phone on his desk buzzed. Liana's voice came through the intercom. "Sir, prison administration is on the line. They've approved a special visit." Elijah pressed the button. "Confirm the name?" "Kareem Ward." He closed his eyes for a second, then stood. Back inside the prison, Kareem was escorted into a private visitation room. He wore a clean shirt this time. His cuts were healing, but the bruise near his jaw still carried a dark shadow. He sat down across the metal table and waited. When the door opened, Elijah stepped in alone. No cameras, no reporters. Just two brothers, divided by years of silence, and now a wall of glass that couldn't be seen, but was very much there. Kareem didn't stand. He didn't speak first. He just looked at Elijah with that same calm he had in court. But something in his eyes had changed. They weren't distant anymore. They held questions. Elijah pulled the chair out and sat. His suit looked out of place in the sterile room, but his face didn't. He looked tired, honest. He looked like someone carrying the weight of more than just power. "I didn't come here to ask for forgiveness," Elijah said quietly. "Good," Kareem replied. Elijah nodded. "But I had to come." Kareem leaned back. "I didn't ask you to do any of this." "I know. That's why I did it." A long silence followed. Not uncomfortable, just full. "I watched you take that sentence like a man who had already lost everything," Elijah continued. "But I couldn't watch you disappear." "You didn't come to the trial," Kareem said. "I didn't know until the last minute. When I got there, it was already too late, and I didn't want my name to become your defense." "You think it would have helped?" "I think it would have made things worse," Elijah said honestly. "And you didn't deserve worse." Kareem looked down at his hands, then back up. "So what now?" Elijah looked him in the eye. "Now the judge who sentenced you is under full investigation. His bench has been suspended. The board has pulled his cases for review, and I've already started the process to get your sentence re-examined." Kareem didn't react right away, just breathed out slowly. "And you're doing all this because I'm your brother?" Elijah shook his head. I'm doing it because you're not the only one, but you're the one that made me see it." Kareem stared at him for a moment, then leaned forward slightly. "I've been sitting in here thinking about everything. How I ended up in that courtroom. What I could have done different. And the truth is, I didn't do anything wrong. But that didn't stop it." Elijah nodded. Kareem added, "You think they'll let me go?" "I think they're running out of reasons to keep you." They sat in silence again. But this time, it wasn't cold. It was the kind of quiet where things started to shift. Not fix, but shift. A guard stepped into the room and tapped his watch. Time was up. Elijah stood first. Kareem stayed seated. Before walking out, Elijah looked back and said, "This isn't over." Kareem replied, "For the first time, I know." The door shut behind him, and for the first time in weeks, Kareem allowed himself to believe, just a little, that the system didn't win yet. The day after the prison visit, Elijah sat at the long table inside the governor's private briefing room, with his senior advisors gathered around. The tone was different now, sharper, more focused. Every person at that table knew they were no longer managing a quiet internal issue. This was a statewide eruption. A judge had been suspended. The legal system was under a microscope, and the man at the center of it, Kareem Ward, was no longer invisible. Elijah's chief legal advisor, Raymond Chen, flipped through a thick binder and spoke without lifting his head. "We've confirmed over 45 cases under O'Connor are now under review. Of those, more than 20 show serious sentencing irregularities, especially for first-time Black defendants. All the numbers line up with what the press is already reporting. Elijah didn't blink. Start the process to publicly request retrials. Quietly reach out to the public defenders assigned to those cases. Let them know the state is watching this now. Raymond nodded and marked it down. Another advisor, Julia, leaned forward. Governor, we have to consider pushback. Judicial unions, older lawmakers, even donors. You're about to reopen hundreds of wounds. Good, Elijah said simply. Let them bleed in the open. Maybe then someone will care. Julia hesitated. There's another thing. Judge O'Connor has filed an injunction. He's suing the state for defamation and abuse of executive power. He's accusing you of launching a personal attack. Elijah didn't even flinch. Let him. Raymond glanced up. We'll beat that in court. He's trying to throw a punch from the floor. Let him swing. But Elijah was already looking past that. His eyes were focused on the larger picture. This wasn't about just one man anymore. This was about everything O'Connor represented. The silence of the system, the people it buried quietly, the damage that never made the news. He stood up, hands on the table. Prepare a statewide statement, not just to respond to him, but to all of it. I want numbers, names, history. Let the public see what we've been protecting for decades. Julia gave a slow nod. You're sure about this? I'm done protecting ghosts. As his staff went to work, Elijah stepped out onto the balcony outside the room. The city looked calm beneath him, a strange contrast to the storm swirling just under the surface. He thought of Kareem, sitting alone in that cell all those days, carrying the weight of injustice in silence. And not just him. Every man or woman who stood before O'Connor and walked away in chains because they didn't have the right name, the right lawyer, or the right color. Inside the prison, Kareem was starting to notice real changes. Officers no longer looked through him. Some of them spoke now. Others avoided him completely, out of guilt or fear. He couldn't tell. He had been moved to a quieter wing. His food wasn't cold anymore. And a few days ago, they let him call his niece. A surprise visit, one they didn't explain. On that short call, her voice broke into tears the moment she heard him. Uncle Kareem? She had whispered, unsure, like it was a dream. Yeah, baby, I'm here. They said you were getting out. Is it true? He had paused. Not yet, but maybe soon. Now in the yard, he walked laps alone. Every few minutes, someone nodded at him. Fellow inmates, men who once kept their distance. Now they watched him like something rare, not famous, not feared, but respected. As if somehow just being near him meant something had shifted. One afternoon, a younger inmate named Deshaun walked beside him, quiet at first, then spoke. You got someone out there fighting for you. Kareem didn't respond. Deshaun kept talking. Heard it on the radio. Said you got the judge pulled. Whole damn courthouse is buzzing. Kareem glanced sideways. You believe it? Deshaun smiled faintly. I believe whatever makes them shake like they're shaking right now. Later that night, as the yard lights dimmed and Kareem lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, a guard appeared at his door. He opened it but didn't say much. Pack your things, he said. You're being moved. Kareem sat up slowly. To where? The guard checked a paper, then looked at him. Protective housing, governor's orders, full legal review scheduled in 72 hours. Kareem didn't move for a moment. He just sat there, breathing. He had learned not to trust anything too fast, not to hold on to hope too tightly. But this wasn't talk. This was action. He began packing in silence. Across the city, O'Connor sat alone in his home. His name had become toxic. The courthouse had emptied. Former allies had gone quiet. No one answered his calls now except his lawyer, who only spoke in warnings. He picked up the newspaper. There was his photo. Headline, Judge removed, Governor calls for systemic reform. He gripped the page tightly, then crumpled it and threw it across the room. The walls were closing in and he knew it. And far away in a cell that felt less like a cage and more like a waiting room, Kareem sat on the edge of his bunk, staring through the bars. The weight wasn't gone, but for the first time, it wasn't growing heavier. For the first time, it felt like someone was lifting it with him. The courtroom was silent except for the soft clicking of keyboards from the stenographer and the slow turning of legal papers. It was a closed hearing. No reporters, no cameras, no audience. Only the necessary few. Kareem sat at the defense table in a dark, clean suit provided by the state, wrist-free for the first time in months. His hair was neatly trimmed, face calm, but his eyes were sharp, locked forward. Across from him sat the new defense attorney, Rachel Klein, a sharp but quiet woman who had reviewed every second of his trial over the past 3 weeks. Next to her stood a senior official from the state's attorney's office, specially assigned to oversee the sentence review. This wasn't a retrial, not yet, but it was the first crack in the walls that had held him in. The judge presiding today wasn't O'Connor. That man had disappeared from the bench days ago. In his place sat Judge Nora Greer, a woman known for balance and no patience for politics. She adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file in front of her. "Mr. Ward," she began, voice calm, "this review concerns the sentencing you received under Judge Clarence O'Connor in the case of unlawful possession of stolen property. The court has found sufficient cause to re-examine that sentencing under judicial ethics review. Do you have anything you wish to say at this time?" Kareem paused. The room waited. He leaned slightly forward, his voice clear. "No one listened to me the first time. That's the only thing I'll say." Judge Greer gave a slow nod and turned to the prosecutor. "Proceed." What followed was 20 minutes of quiet destruction. Rachel Klein presented her findings methodically. The rushed plea deal, the public defender who didn't file proper motions, the lack of forensic analysis on the phone found in the car. No proof Kareem ever touched it, no fingerprints, no location history connecting him to the phone, and most importantly, no justification for a 22-year sentence, especially for a man with no criminal record. Then came the timeline of Judge O'Connor's rulings, how Kareem's sentence had come only days after O'Connor acquired new stock in a prison management company. Rachel didn't accuse him of corruption directly. She didn't have to. The timing was enough. And as she spoke, the prosecutor didn't argue. He just listened, because the state had no interest in defending that sentence anymore. Kareem sat through it all in silence. He didn't smile. He didn't shake his head. He just sat, solid, letting the truth land where it needed to. Each fact spoken out loud was a piece of his dignity slowly being returned to him. At the end, Judge Greer closed the file, hands folded in front of her. She was quiet for a long time. "This court acknowledges that the sentencing applied in your case was excessive, unsupported by the presented evidence, and carried out under questionable ethical conditions. This court cannot reverse the original conviction without a separate retrial, but I am vacating the sentence effective immediately. You are to be released into monitored supervision while a formal appeal process begins. Full exoneration is not granted at this time, but your physical freedom is restored." Kareem didn't react, not outwardly. Inside, something cracked, but not in a painful way, more like a dam finally letting water through. His hands stayed still, but his breathing changed. As the courtroom emptied, Rachel Klein turned to him and said quietly, "It's not over, but it's starting." Outside, Elijah waited in a black car with tinted windows. He didn't want a spectacle. He had refused all media. This was Kareem's moment, not his. When Kareem stepped out of the courthouse, there was no crowd, no flashes, just the low hum of the city and his brother standing a few steps away. They looked at each other for a few seconds. Neither moved first. Then Kareem walked toward him. Not fast, not hesitant either. He stopped a few feet away and looked Elijah in the eye. "You really came through," he said, voice even. Elijah nodded once. "I should have sooner." They stood there. Both men changed. Older, sharper, quieter than they'd been before all of this. Then Elijah opened the car door. "Let's go home," he said. Kareem didn't answer right away. He looked back at the courthouse, at the heavy stone and tall windows, then down at his own hands. Free hands. He nodded once and got in the car. As they pulled away from the courthouse, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The silence was no longer a barrier between them. It was just space. Space for something new to begin. But as they drove through the city, both men knew that this was only part of the storm. There would be more hearings, more names, more walls that needed to fall, and they were ready for it. The news of Kareem's release spread fast. Though it wasn't a full exoneration, it didn't matter to the public. To them, it was a symbol. A man wrongfully buried by the system had walked out of prison because someone finally had pulled back the curtain. In every corner of the state, his name now carried weight. For some, it was hope. For others, it was a warning. Within hours, news outlets ran with headlines like, "Governor's brother freed after judge's removal," and "Is this the start of real justice reform?" Talk shows debated the case all day. Social media exploded. Videos from Kareem's old neighborhood started trending. People stood in front of murals, shouting his name. One video showed a group of teenagers chanting, "They tried to hide him. Now he's home." But not everyone was celebrating. Behind closed doors, pressure was building. Elijah's push for a statewide judicial audit had opened a box many hoped would never be touched. Emails began leaking from old court officials, exposing decades of ignored complaints, buried evidence, and closed-door favors. Some tried to defend the system, calling it imperfect but functioning. Others blamed the media for turning one case into a movement. But Elijah didn't back down. He stood before a packed room of legislators, cameras flashing, microphones pointed, and made his stance clear. "I did not act as a brother. I acted as a leader responsible for the law. And if the law is blind, then we must teach it to listen." He paused. "There are hundreds of people in this state who never had a fair day in court. We've allowed power to shield bias and silence to bury truth. That ends now." The room erupted, some in applause, others in argument. One senator stormed out. But Elijah didn't look away from the podium. He knew what was coming. They would try to paint him as emotional, as reckless, as too involved. He didn't care, because while they argued over appearances, Kareem was trying to adjust to a world that had moved on without him. He stayed in a quiet house Elijah had prepared outside the city. No press, no cameras, just space. Every room felt too big, every night too quiet. He'd wake up before sunrise, sit on the porch, and stare into the trees trying to understand what freedom meant now. Sometimes he thought about the men he left behind, some guilty, some not, all stuck in the same machine that almost swallowed him. He thought about Darnell, the friend who gave him the car, the one who disappeared after the trial. He thought about the public defender who never called a single witness. And he thought about O'Connor, who hadn't even looked at him when reading the sentence. One morning, Elijah came to visit. No suit this time, just jeans and a sweater. He walked onto the porch, sat next to Kareem, and offered him a cup of coffee. They sat in silence for a while, both sipping slowly. Then Kareem spoke. "What happens now?" Elijah looked straight ahead. "We keep going." Kareem nodded. "For them?" "For all of us," Elijah replied. Kareem leaned back, exhaled through his nose. "You know they'll come after you for this." "They already are." "You ready?" Elijah took a sip. "I was born ready. I just forgot for a while." A pause, then Kareem asked, "You ever think about how it could have gone the other way?" Every day. They fell quiet again, watching the wind move through the trees. The storm had passed, but not far. The rain had stopped falling, but the clouds still hung low. Elijah knew this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something bigger. He had cracked open the system. Now he had to tear it apart piece by piece. And Kareem, who never asked to be a symbol, was now a name they couldn't ignore. Back in the city, a new report surfaced. 3 other judges were quietly being investigated. A memo leaked showing private meetings between O'Connor and multiple prosecutors, meetings that had no record. A private prison company released a nervous statement distancing itself from the scandal, and Elijah's office was flooded with letters, some hateful, others grateful. One, from a woman whose son had been sentenced by O'Connor 5 years ago, simply read, "You didn't just save your brother. You saved mine too." Meanwhile, Clarence O'Connor sat in a high-rise apartment, curtains drawn, phone silent. He no longer answered the door. His friends had stopped calling. His lawyer had advised him to lay low. Every time he turned on the TV, he saw his own name being picked apart by strangers. Every time he stepped outside, someone recognized him, not with respect, but disgust. He poured a drink and sat at his desk, the same desk where he once reviewed case files like Kareem's with a flick of the wrist and a heavy hand. Now there was nothing to review. Nothing but the sound of his own downfall, playing out in every corner of the state. And in that silence, Clarence O'Connor finally began to understand what it felt like to be powerless, just like the men he had sentenced. The sun was just beginning to rise over the city when Kareem stepped off the porch and took a long walk down the quiet road leading away from the house. Dew clung to the grass, the air was thick with the scent of wet pine, and the stillness of morning wrapped around him like a heavy coat. For weeks he had stayed silent, processing, breathing, watching the world speak his name while he said nothing. But now something inside him stirred. A need to speak, not for revenge, not even for justice, but for the weight he'd carried silently for too long. Elijah had offered to handle everything, to keep Kareem out of the spotlight. But Kareem knew that silence had already cost him years. He wasn't going to spend freedom hiding behind someone else's voice. Later that afternoon, against Elijah's advice, Kareem agreed to a televised interview. No podium, no press conference, just one camera, one room, and his story told the way it happened. The production team was small, respectful, and didn't push too hard. The interviewer, a woman named Vanessa Cruz, sat across from him with her notepad closed, hands resting on her knees. When they handed down the sentence, she asked softly, "What was the first thing that went through your mind?" Kareem sat still for a moment before speaking. "I thought about my sister and my niece. I thought about what it would do to her to grow up without me. What it would mean for her to believe that I was a criminal because a man in a robe said so." The camera stayed fixed on his face, calm but firm. His voice never shook. He spoke of the arrest, the silence in the courtroom, the way the handcuffs felt tighter after the sentence was read. He didn't cry. He didn't rage. He just told the truth. When Vanessa asked about O'Connor, Kareem paused. "He didn't see me. Not really. He saw who he wanted me to be. And once he decided that, nothing else mattered." "And your brother," she asked gently, "what did it mean to have him fight for you?" Kareem looked down, then back up. "We weren't close. Life pulled us apart. But when it mattered, he showed up. That matters." The interview ran that evening. No dramatic music, no flashing graphics. Just Kareem, framed against a quiet background, telling a story that so many people recognized in pieces of their own lives. Across the country, people watched, in barbershops and living rooms, in dorm halls and subway screens. The video went viral within hours, not because it was loud, but because it was real. And while the world listened, so did the courts. That same week, an official motion was filed by the state attorney's office requesting a full retrial for Kareem Ward. Not just a sentence review, but a dismissal of the original conviction. The evidence, the bias, the prosecutorial shortcuts, none of it held up anymore. Judge Nora Greer, once again presiding, signed off on the motion. "This court acknowledges the foundation of this conviction was compromised," she stated firmly. "We will not carry forward injustice simply because it was written on paper first." And just like that, Kareem was no longer out on supervised release. He was free, fully, no ankle monitor, no court dates, no case hanging over his head. He walked out of the courthouse alone. No entourage. Just a quiet man with his shoulders squared, a small folder in his hand, holding his release documents, and a new air in his lungs. But outside, the world had been waiting. This time there was a crowd, not chaotic, but present. People clapped softly. Some just stood with signs. Justice took too long. How many more? Kareem today. Who tomorrow? And then he saw her, his niece, Zara, standing at the edge of the steps, her small hands holding a paper sign that said, "Welcome home, Uncle K," in pink letters. Her eyes lit up the moment she saw him. Kareem froze. He hadn't seen her in person since the day of the arrest. She had grown, taller now, still had her mother's smile. He walked toward her slowly, as if afraid she'd disappear. She ran to him before he could finish the first step. When her arms wrapped around his waist, the weight of everything, the prison cell, the court hearings, the silence, the anger, poured out of him in one long breath. He closed his eyes, held her tighter than he thought possible, and let himself feel it. Really feel it. Behind them, Elijah stood to the side, watching. No cameras on him, no spotlight. Just a man who had broken a system wide open to bring his brother home. The battle wasn't over. O'Connor's case was still ongoing. More judges were under review. Policies were being rewritten. There were marches, protests, resistance from every corner of the old guard. But none of that mattered in that moment. In that moment, there was just Kareem. Free, finally. Not just from a prison cell, but from being forgotten. The days that followed Kareem's full exoneration moved fast. Faster than anything he'd experienced inside a prison cell. His name was everywhere. On talk shows, podcasts, headlines, posters at rallies. But none of it felt real. Not yet. Every time he turned on the television and saw his own face, heard people debating his case like it was part of some national game board, he felt like he was watching someone else's life, someone else's pain. What the world was calling a victory, Kareem still carried like a scar. He spent most of his time in the small house Elijah had arranged, trying to find rhythm in the ordinary. Morning coffee, evening walks, calls from old friends who didn't know what to say anymore. Strangers mailed him letters, some with long, painful stories of their own. Others just said thank you. Kareem read each one quietly, carefully, as if every sentence was part of a language he was still relearning, the language of freedom. But while Kareem tried to adjust, Elijah was back in the fire. The state legislature had erupted into debate. Some praised him as a reformer. Others accused him of pushing personal agendas into the courtroom. A few even tried to launch a motion to limit executive oversight over judicial matters. It failed, but the message was clear. They were nervous. And then came the backlash. One evening, Elijah sat at his desk, reading through a thick envelope sent anonymously to his office. Inside were photocopied letters from other judges. Words like dangerous, emotional, manipulative. One judge wrote, "If the governor can remove one of us with political pressure, none of us are safe." Elijah placed the letters aside and picked up his pen. He wrote a response that would be published in every major paper across the state the next morning. Judges who fear accountability do not fear injustice. They fear the loss of unchecked power. And if removing one man who abused that power shakes your bench, then maybe it was never stable to begin with. Meanwhile, in the shadows of the courthouse system, O'Connor was unraveling. The official investigation had uncovered damning records, a chain of backdoor deals with private detention companies, pressure placed on public defenders to accept plea deals quickly, a private email thread with prosecutors where he referred to black defendants as untamed and built for discipline. The language alone was enough to end a career. The money trail added fuel to the fire. His legal team tried to spin it as political slander. They said he was being sacrificed for a governor's personal gain. But no one was listening anymore. Not even the courts that once protected him. 1 week later, Judge Clarence O'Connor was disbarred. His name stripped from the official registry. His former courtroom reassigned. His cases reopened. He didn't show up to the hearing. He stayed in his apartment, curtains drawn, and watched the news report it like a weather update. Simple, cold, final. Back in Kareem's neighborhood, things had changed. The corner store owner, who once looked away when Kareem walked in, now shook his hand. Old neighbors invited him over for dinner. Young men stopped him on the sidewalk just to say, "You made it out, man. You really made it out." But Kareem didn't feel like a hero. He felt like a man still waking up from a long nightmare. One afternoon, he sat with Zara on a bench outside a small park. She was drawing in a notebook, head tilted, tongue peeking out the side of her mouth as she concentrated. He watched her quietly, the way someone watches something they're afraid might disappear. "What are you drawing?" he asked softly. She held up the paper, a picture of him standing in front of a courthouse with big red words above it. "Free," Kareem smiled. "You're getting good at that." She beamed. "They made us talk about you at school. The teacher said you were brave." Kareem looked down. "I don't know about that. She said you changed things." He was quiet for a second. "Maybe. Maybe not." Zara frowned a little. "Why wouldn't you want people to say nice things about you?" He looked at her gently. "Because if they only tell the ending, they'll forget the middle. And that's where the pain lives." Zara didn't fully understand, but she nodded anyway because she trusted his words. That night, Kareem sat at the edge of his bed, reading one of the letters that had come in the mail. It was from a mother whose son had just received a retrial because of Kareem's case. She wrote that she hadn't believed in justice anymore until she saw him walk out of that courthouse. At the bottom, she had written, "They couldn't silence you. And because of that, my son has a voice again." Kareem folded the letter and placed it in a small box on his nightstand. He didn't keep much. But that letter stayed. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The world kept spinning. And in a city that was still healing, still broken in places, one man was learning how to live again. Not as an inmate, not as a symbol, just as himself. Kareem Ward. Weeks passed. The media frenzy began to fade, replaced by new headlines, new crises, new noise. But the impact of Kareem's story didn't disappear. It settled deep into the bones of the system he'd once been crushed by. Judges across the state were placed under quiet review. A bill bearing his name, the Ward Judicial Oversight Act, was introduced in the state legislature, aimed at enforcing sentence transparency and limiting private business ties among courtroom officials. It was still being debated, but its existence alone was a message. Things were changing. Elijah continued to push reform, using the momentum as leverage. He met with activists, families, and lawyers who'd been fighting for years without support. But he also stepped back from the spotlight more often. He'd seen what power could do when left unchecked. He knew how close he had come to letting silence cost him everything that mattered. For Kareem, life began to settle into something quieter, slower. No cameras followed him now. No reporters waited at his door. The world had moved on, but he hadn't forgotten. He spent time mentoring at a local youth center, talking to boys who reminded him too much of himself. He helped one kid get a job interview, drove another to court when his family couldn't. He didn't preach. He just showed up. And for many of them, that was more than anyone ever had. One evening, he stood in front of a small group at a local community hall. No stage, no podium, just a few folding chairs and people who wanted to listen. The room was warm, the lights low, the silence respectful. Someone asked him how he stayed calm during everything, how he survived. Kareem took a moment before answering. "I didn't survive it calm," he said. "I survived it quiet. I buried everything because I thought if I made too much noise, they'd shut the door harder. I only started breathing again when I realized someone on the other side was finally listening." A pause. "My story shouldn't be rare, but it is. And that's not on me. That's on what we've allowed." When the gathering ended, people came up to shake his hand. A few left in tears. One man hugged him without saying a word. Kareem accepted it all with quiet grace. Not because he saw himself as a leader, but because he understood what it meant to be seen after being invisible for so long. Later that night, he sat on the porch of the small house with Elijah beside him. They didn't talk much anymore. Not about the case, not about what they lost. Some things had been said. Others had been understood in silence. Elijah broke the stillness. "You ever think about what you're going to do next?" Kareem didn't answer right away. Then he looked out at the dark sky, stars scattered like scattered hopes finally falling into place. "I don't know yet," he said, "but for the first time, I get to choose." Elijah nodded slowly. "That's something. It's everything." They sat there a little longer, two brothers who had walked through fire in different shoes, one with power, the other with pain, and now finally on the same ground. No chains, no walls. Just freedom, earned, fought for, and no longer taken for granted. The world had tried to write Kareem Ward's story without him, but in the end, he wrote the final page himself. If this story moved you, make sure to like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this one.